I first noticed the story in the barn measurements, not in the county histories, not in the newspaper fragments, but in the dimensions no ordinary farm required. The east doors were too high. The north stall was too strong. The floor had been doubled beneath a space where no livestock was kept. By the time the army came, the farmer was no longer sleeping in the house. He was sitting beside the hidden man, listening to a warning he would spend the rest of his life failing to explain. The soldiers removed the body. They did not remove the question. The first difficulty is that no official record agrees to begin where the local memory begins. The file, if there ever was one, does not open with a giant. It opens with an old farm, a widowed man, a barn too large for its purpose, and a series of alterations that later explanations tried to make ordinary. That distinction matters. The Miller place stood on poor soil at the edge of a township that had no reason to preserve its embarrassments. The later county history describes it in one sentence as a marginal property improved and then abandoned during the years after the war. No mention is made of the barn beyond its removal. No mention is made of the farmer's change in habits, the blocked windows, the reinforced north bay, or the morning when uniforms closed the road before anyone in town understood what was being taken. The official version, where it survives, is almost useful in its thinness. A lonely farmer builds an oversized barn. Children invent a shape in the dark. Neighbors repeat the story until the building becomes more interesting than the man who owned it. The old farmer dies or leaves. The structure falls apart, and the legend outlives the lumber. That would be enough if the structure had behaved like a legend. It did not. The east doors were raised above any practical need for hay wagons used in that district. Their iron straps were not decorative, not the small hinges of an ambitious farm building, but heavy bands broad enough to suggest repeated strain. The ridgepole rose high, but the height alone is not the point. Farmers build tall barns. What they do not usually do is strengthen one internal stall as though the rest of the building were incidental to it. The North Bay had no ordinary animal arrangement. No manger is remembered there. No feed box. No line of hooks for tack. What survives in family description is a floor doubled over buried sleepers, with the supports placed closer together than the rest of the structure. That is a practical decision, and practical decisions leave questions behind. Timber was expensive. Labor was expensive. A poor farmer does not reinforce a useless corner unless the word useless is wrong. I want to be precise. None of this proves the giant. What it proves is smaller and more durable. The barn was modified around something that required concealment, weight, height, and repeated access. The farmer treated that part of the building differently from every other part. The community noticed enough to develop rules around it before it developed a story. A lantern was seen late in the North Bay when the house was dark. Water was carried there after midnight, not in buckets for animals, but in the careful rhythm of a man trying not to be observed. In winter, snow softened first along the covered side of the barn. Children were not merely told to stay away. They were told not to answer if they heard movement from inside. That instruction has the texture of fear, but not the kind people later added to make the tale entertaining. It sounds less like fear of a monster than fear of recognition. Do not answer. Do not speak. Do not let whatever is hidden know you are close enough to become part of the secret. The farmer himself did not profit from it. That is worth noticing. He did not charge visitors. He did not call reporters. He did not write to a museum or a traveling exhibition. His behavior, at least in the fragments left behind, was not the behavior of a man inventing a marvel. It was the behavior of a man sheltering a burden. And then, before the story could become public enough to be ridiculed, the army came. Witnesses placed the first wagon on the western road before sunrise. That detail matters because it weakens the later explanation that the matter began as a local disturbance. If the issue had been a dead vagrant, the sheriff would have arrived first. If it had been illness, a doctor would have entered the account. If it had been a body requiring identification, the coroner would have left some municipal trace. Instead, there were uniforms, canvas-covered wagons, and officers who did not stop at the house to ask directions. They already knew where the barn was. The farmer was found inside, seated near the north stall, with a blanket over his knees and a lantern burning low beside him. He had not slept. He had not sent for help. According to the version repeated in the family, he only asked them not to close the doors yet. That request was refused. By then the farm was no longer a farm in any ordinary sense. It had become a site. The road was sealed. Neighbors were held beyond the fence line. The east doors were opened under orders. And whatever had been hidden in the Miller barn passed, in that hour, from local memory into institutional custody. The men who entered the yard did not move like men discovering an impossibility. They moved like men confirming the location of one. That is one of the harder details to explain away. Surprise leaves disorder. It produces argument, delay. A second authority called in from town. A physician asked to look. A sheriff asked to sign. What appears in the surviving account is the opposite. The officers arrived with a sequence already in mind. One went to the road, one to the lower field, two to the east doors. A canvas screen was carried forward before anything had been publicly named. When a neighbor later claimed that he saw the sheet lifted from the wagon while the doors were still closed, he was not describing panic. He was describing preparation. No doctor was called. That absence has to be kept in view. If the hidden occupant had been only a deformed man, a sick stranger, a veteran, a captive, or a corpse discovered in a barn, medicine should have entered the record somewhere. If a crime had been suspected, the sheriff should have controlled the scene. If a death had occurred, the county should have produced its ordinary instruments. A certificate, a coroner's notation, a burial entry, a name written into the proper column. None of those traces survive. What survives instead is procedure without explanation. The window on the north wall was covered from the outside. The fence line was cleared. The road was held. The farmer was ordered back from the stall, not because he was dangerous, but because he had become the last uncontrolled witness inside the room. The soldiers brought crates before they brought the stretcher. That detail is small, and it is easy to pass over it too quickly. But if the operation had concerned only the removal of a body, the crates make little sense. Boards were taken from the interior wall. A section of floor was lifted. A trunk from the tack room was opened and removed. A stone near the rear foundation, described in one account as marked on the underside, was pried loose and wrapped before being placed into a wagon. The official explanation does not account for that. It is possible, of course, that every later witness exaggerated what was removed. It is possible the crates held tools or medical supplies or ordinary equipment misremembered by people watching from a distance. A careful account has to allow for that. But it also has to account for the pattern. The soldiers appear to have taken not random objects, but surfaces that could preserve contact, notation, measurement, or memory. The inside of the north stall was scraped. Some versions say there were marks cut into the wall. Others say they looked like tally lines. One descendant, writing much later, refused to describe them at all and called them only old marks not made by tools we knew. That kind of caution is more convincing than embellishment. A person inventing a giant usually adds detail. A person trying not to inherit ridicule removes it. Still, the scraping remains. Scratches do not usually require removal. Weathered boards do not usually require wrapping. If the marks were meaningless, the soldiers could have left them to rot with the building. If they were only the damage of confinement, There would have been no reason to separate them from the rest of the barn. But they were taken, or destroyed, or made unavailable, which is to say, they were treated as evidence before the public was permitted to know there had been a question. The farmer watched most of this without speaking. Only when the canvas was brought inside did he repeat the warning. The accounts disagree on whether he said it to the officer, to a neighbor beyond the door, or to himself. But they agree on the phrase. An agreement around a phrase is rare in stories that survive only by family memory. They will take the witnesses first, not the bodies, not the giants, the witnesses. The farmer asked what that meant before dawn, according to the version kept longest in the family. The hidden man was already too weak to stand. His voice, if the memory can be trusted, had become difficult to understand. He touched the floor beside him, then the wall, then pointed through the open doors toward the fields beyond the creek. Not people only. That was the second phrase, and it is the phrase that makes the first one harder to reduce to fear. The farmer would have understood danger to people. He would have understood soldiers taking a body, silencing a household, warning neighbors away. What he did not yet understand was that a witness could be a road, a field name, a stone boundary, a plank worn smooth by years of contact, a map that still remembered an older arrangement of the land. To the farmer, the farm was weather, debt, soil, water, fences, harvest, winter. To the hidden man, if the testimony preserves even a portion of what he meant, the farm was a page inside a larger record. The creek line was not only drainage. The buried road beneath the pasture was not only inconvenience. The reused stones along the foundation were not only cheap building material. They were fragments of a system that had survived by becoming ordinary. Someone understood that the soldier's behavior makes more sense if they were not merely removing a body, but detaching it from every object that could support the story after the body was gone. Boards, essays, stones, papers, floor marks, family notes, the altered stall itself. These were the witnesses that remained when speech failed. The farmer stood beside the north bay as the canvas was lowered. He had kept the hidden man alive, or hidden, or both, for years. But in that final hour he seems to have understood that custody had changed categories. The secret was no longer between a farmer and the impossible person he had sheltered. It had become an administrative matter. The body was carried out under canvas. Then the crates followed. The warning did not survive because anyone wrote it down in the proper place. It survived because it was repeated in rooms where people still understood that some sentences become dangerous when they are given paper. They will take the witnesses first. For a while, the farmer seems to have misunderstood the sentence in the ordinary human way. He believed the witnesses were people, himself, the neighbor at the fence, the children who had heard movement in the North Bay, anyone who might have seen the shape under canvas, or the hand that had worn the plank smooth beside the stall. That interpretation was not wrong. It was only incomplete. Within 2 seasons, the road beyond the creek was no longer described by its older name. A new county survey straightened the boundary and made the abandoned path appear accidental, as though it had never been more than a wagon track cut by convenience. The stones along the south ridge disappeared next. Some were broken into culverts. Some were set into cellar walls. A few were said to have markings on the buried side, which is the kind of detail that later generations learn not to repeat. Field names changed more quietly. North Hollow became North Field. Giant's Rest, where the older tax fragments had placed a low rise near the creek, became Lot 7. The difference looks small on paper. That is the point. Erasure rarely announces itself as erasure. It arrives as correction, improvement, standardization, modernization, the replacement of an embarrassing word with a useful one. That distinction matters more than it first appears. A name is not proof. A road is not proof. A marked stone reused under a foundation is not proof. But taken together, they form the kind of record official language is very good at dissolving, not by denying it directly, by making each piece too small to defend alone. The farmer appears to have understood this too late. After the removal, he stopped repairing the east doors. He left them to sag through winter, even though the gap between them let snow blow across the threshing floor. He sold 2 parcels at a loss. He refused, according to one family account, to sign a county statement describing the barn as unsafe and improperly built. After that refusal, his name becomes harder to follow. What survives in the public record is clean enough to be suspicious. The land changed hands. The barn was altered. The upper timbers were cut down and reused. The reinforced floor in the north bay was pulled apart for salvage, though salvage is a convenient word for dismantling the only part of the building constructed as though ordinary weight had never been the problem. By the time the property reappeared in print, there was no hidden occupant, no army visit, no sealed road, no farmer repeating a warning he could not explain. There was only an agricultural improvement on a marginal farm. This is how a removal becomes a legend. First, the body goes, then the objects that touched it, then the records that might have made the objects meaningful, then the names of the places where the records would have pointed. What remains is not nothing. It is worse than nothing. It is a story that sounds too large to believe and too damaged to prove. And once a story reaches that condition, official culture does not need to refute it. It only has to wait. The Miller barn, if the surviving descriptions are reliable, was not important because it contained a giant. That would have been spectacle, and spectacle is easy to bury once the witness dies. The barn mattered because it briefly held together a chain of evidence. Altered architecture, local memory, land names, marked surfaces, military procedure, and one dying warning that connected them before the connection was removed. They will take the witnesses first. I do not know whether the hidden man was the last of anything. I do not know whether the farmer understood what he had sheltered, or whether he only understood that the world had become smaller after the wagons left. But the behavior around the story is harder to dismiss than the story itself. Folklore does not require canvas screens. A rural exaggeration does not require sealed roads. A dead stranger does not require boards, stones, papers, and field names to vanish behind him. The simplest explanation is not the safest one. What was taken from the barn was a body, yes, but also a context, a set of references by which that body might still have meant something after removal. The giant was treated not as a monster, not as a medical curiosity, not even as a prisoner, but as a witness attached to other witnesses. And the removal was successful only when those attachments were broken. That is why the final warning remains difficult. It was not a prediction of the army's arrival. They had already arrived somewhere else before. It was a description of method. First the witnesses, then the places that remembered them, then the words by which those places could still be found. By the time the last person who had seen the Norse stall was gone, the event had become impossible in exactly the way useful erasures become impossible. Too strange to enter history, too persistent to die. The barn is gone now, or altered beyond recognition, depending on which county account is trusted. But the question it left behind is still standing. Why would an impossible story require such ordinary instruments of control? Wagons, ledgers, surveys, silence. No preserved answer explains that. And somewhere beneath the corrected names and shortened roads, the warning remains where it was left. Patient, unproven, and not quite removed.